Turkey's ruling party has recently been shaken by serious allegations of embezzlement and misconduct. Some of these allegations have been put forward by a former mob leader, Sedat Peker. Of course, corruption within the AKP government is not new. And what we know is probably only tip of the iceberg. More incriminating details will most likely surface after the AKP loses power in future. But I find such allegations to be an opportune moment to discuss the web of corruption formed by AKP over the last 2 decades. Now, of course, AKP has engaged in partisan allocation of resources to crony businesses and select group of constituencies. But I think the form of this corruption changed over time due to the changes within the ruling elite as well as the party's structure. Now, AKP was initially formed in 2001 with huge political support coming from conservative Anatolian business people. These are entrepreneurs who were, in fact, happy with and benefited from Turkey's integration to the world market starting from the 1980s. And they wanted a conservative political party that would follow a liberal trade policy, but would also cater to their political needs and would push for a conservative cultural agenda. And AKP was, in turn, happy to funnel state contracts, legal tenders, and all sorts of resources to these groups after it came to power. So in its early years, probably the first 2 or maybe even 3 terms of this party, the AKP established a very partisan majoritarian regime, allocated resources to its supporters, particularly within the business community. This, of course, resulted in a certain level of corruption that increased over time. And in turn, the AKP obtained support from these conservative business people as well as conservative voters. Now, what we're increasingly seeing over the past decade is an evolution of this partisan authoritarian regime under the tight leadership of President Erdoğan. Now, in a nutshell, when AKP was initially formed, it was the party was an amalgamation of what you could call to be 2 distinct factions. One faction was composed more of traditional politicians who were based in Ankara and familiar with national level politics. So figures like Abdullah Gül, Bülent Arınç, Abdülatif Şener, and Ali Babacan and so on. These are people who knew the state, could take control of the bureaucracy, could adopt a comprehensive economic agenda after the party came to power. And as part of this economic agenda, they subscribe to neoliberal economic ideas, which, as I already told you, allowed them to curry favors with businesses, but particularly those conservative Anatolian business people who were politically supporting the party. So this was one faction. The second faction was composed more of local party chapters and obviously local political elites within the AKP. These were mostly tied to AKP mayors, controlling major municipalities such as Istanbul, Ankara, and several other provinces around the country. These mayors were at the center of rent-seeking, urban rent-seeking, and resource distribution that occurred under social programs to the urban poor, to the needy constituencies within the country, but also through urban renewal projects, municipality companies, and so on. These figures, these mayors, had access to money, had easier access to voters, and they really took benefit of that. I think Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, who for several years was a former mayor of Istanbul, was really the prototype of this type of politician. And he really, over time, increased its control over this second faction of the party. Now, the 2 groups cooperated for a long while, especially when AKP in power faced strong resistance from the bureaucracy and the military, composed of secular actors at the time. But starting from probably the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, the 2 groups began to experience rifts and major disagreements, particularly over the policymaking process. Now, unlike the first faction that wanted to promote neoliberal economic policies that were favoring business elites, particularly those connected to the party, but also wanted to retain central bank autonomy and subscribe to the laws, the economic laws of this neoliberal agenda. Erdoğan wanted more flexibility in his economic policy making. He strayed away from the neoliberal model in favor of a more personalistic, more corrupt, more, if you will, crony capitalist format. Now, under his watch as first prime minister and then later as president, he wanted to be the person to decide who to give the state contracts, the public projects. He wanted to increase emphasis and resources for the construction sector, energy sector, and the healthcare sector. Now, these are not incidentally labor-rich areas, right, that allowed the party to create employment for the urban poor, which was the core base of the party. It also created more perks for Erdoğan's regime, as well as the people who supported Erdoğan. Of course, in these crony sectors, it's a lot easier to get corrupt deals because these are sectors that have low levels of productivity and where state intervention plays a big role. Now, this allowed Erdoğan to monopolize power within the party, starting from 2008, 2009. And over time, as AKP kept on winning elections, Erdoğan, who became the sole decision maker within the party, instituted an hegemonic control over the Turkish political system, which paved the way to our current presidential system, which has very limited checks and balances, and the president calls all the shots. Now, as a result of this transformation, corruption ties within the ruling party also changed quite dramatically. And we've seen corruption, major cases of embezzlement and misconduct and corruption has began to shift from the ruling party. The ruling party was no longer the locus of this corruption. Of course, it remained as a corrupt organization, but it no longer was a locus of these corrupt deals. And it shifted to the Erdoğan's presidential office. Public tenders, state contracts, easy credit from state banks, began to increasingly go to a small number of large conglomerates, which had personal ties to Erdoğan. And so those advisors and politicians encircling Erdoğan gained almost legal immunity as a result of this political transformation, and they began to act with full impunity. And that turned what was initially a partisan authoritarian regime, in other words, an authoritarian regime with a strong political party at the top, to a personalistic neo-patrimonial regime that one could easily call as a kleptocracy.